So we're going to go ahead and get started. It's 4 o'clock and we have a pretty full room. The first couple of slides are introductory slides. So as we let people in, they'll sort of get a sense of what's going on before we move into our full webinar. But as I just said, and if you joined lastly, we ask that you stay muted. You came in muted. We invite you to use the chat box to ask or respond to questions during the presentation. And the workshop is being recorded. So this webinar came to be as a result of, I think, something that we're learning is really important at this moment, and that is the interconnection and the relationships that we have that allow us to do our best in difficult circumstances. And so we at UC Berkeley History Social Science Project are excited to offer this webinar that really comes out of relationships we've developed over the years with authors, community leaders, and teachers who we work closely with. Our agenda for today is, as many of you know, Karen Korematsu, the daughter of Fred Korematsu, was able to join us as a featured speaker. And so after this brief introduction and overview, she's going to share a bit about her father's life and how she shares his life and legacy with others. Then Laura Atkins and Stan Yogi are going to discuss their book, Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, and how they approach that book as a way to share difficult and important history with younger readers. After the discussion, we'll have some Q&A, and so throughout both Karen and Stan and Laura's presentations, feel free to write questions into the chat box, and we'll use those to inform the discussion. Following the first round of discussion, Jennifer Brouhard, who's a teacher leader and teacher in Oakland Unified, will share how she developed a lesson in relationship to the book and in conversation with Karen, Stan, and Laura, and talk about her experience with students. That too will be followed by a Q&A explicitly about the lesson, but also if you continue to have questions for Karen, Laura, and Stan. And then finally, Karen will talk briefly at the end about how she connects her father's legacy to ongoing issues. So before we get started, we want to do a quick poll of who's in the room. So I'm Rachel Reinhardt. I'm the director of the Berkeley History Social Science Project. Jason Muniz, who is academic coordinator with us, will be doing some of the tech behind the scenes, and so he's going to launch the poll. So if you can quickly just let us know where you work, what best describes your role, which region you're from, which best describes the subject you teach, and whether or not you'd heard of Fred Korematsu before you signed up for this webinar. And we'll just take about 30 seconds to find out who's in the room. So just take 15 seconds to complete the poll if you haven't. So it looks like we have a strong elementary contingent, which is really exciting. We wanted to offer this program to teachers of younger children, one, to reinforce history, social science instruction, but also we know that's a space where biography is taught. And so how can we use Fred Korematsu in that? And a lot of people from across California, one of the things we've benefited from with this webinar series is that geography isn't a limit. And so we're great to have our Bay Area friends, but also to see some of you from across the state as well as the nation. And so appreciate bringing this community together. And so because we have elementary school teachers, a lot of different content areas are represented, as well as history, social science. And we're glad to be able to introduce Fred Korematsu to some of you who hadn't heard of Fred Korematsu before, and to amplify your understanding and provide you a new resource if you had. So I'm going to end the polling. And so just briefly, I've sort of said this before, but the goals for this short webinar are broad. We want to explore the historical significance of Fred Korematsu and his life. We also pedagogically want to discuss and think about how picture books can be used to meaningfully support history instruction, even in virtual spaces. Jennifer will be sharing her experience, you know, in live time with her students in her classroom, but also thinking a bit about how this could be shared with students in your current context. Also, we want to acknowledge that at this moment, there's a rise in anti-Asian racism and acts of bigotry. And so we see this webinar as one that's raising the visibility of Asian Americans as longstanding members of the US community. And then, of course, to support the ongoing learning of educators during this difficult time. So I've mentioned our four presenters. Kara Korematsu is the founder and executive director of the Fred T. Korematsu Institute. Laura Atkins and Stan Yogi are local authors who have authored this book, Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, and Jennifer Brouhard is a teacher in Oakland Unified. So Karen is going to unmute herself and talk to us about a bit about who is Fred Korematsu.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, good. All right. Well, thank you all for joining this exciting webinar. Of course, anytime I have an opportunity to share my father's story, I'm always glad to participate. And kudos for Rachel and UC Berkeley for putting on this webinar, and Laura and Stan's book is indeed very special, even though I'm a bit biased, I must say. But the book is also published by Heyday Books, and really I think it's one of the #1 top sellers. So I was thrilled to learn that. First of all, I think that it's important to know that my father was an American citizen. He was born in Oakland, California in 1919, and was the son of immigrant mother and father who came over from Japan in the early 1900s. But he grew up, my father grew up just like any other American kid, and went to Castlemont High School and in Oakland, California, and just loved to do what other kids did at that time, hang out with their friends and eat spaghetti and hot dogs and drive cars when they got to be older. But my father learned about the Constitution in high school. So what I say is he was paying attention that day and was learning about his rights as an American citizen. And so after Pearl Harbor was bombed, and of course here again, over 75 years later, you're talking about the fear of xenophobia, of the start of as we have actually since the beginning of history in this country, the prejudice and the marginalization of people, especially of minorities, or in this case, people who, quote, look like the enemy. And so, my father had experienced racism when he was growing up. And actually, I think Laura is going to talk or read her poem, right, about when my father was refused a haircut as an example of some of the experiences that he endured growing up. And so that really is I think, stays with you for your entire life, and probably is instrumental in the decisions that you make. And so he, just decided that when Executive Order 9066 was issued by President Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942, that, he couldn't believe that American citizens would have to go to a prison camp. And he thought he had rights as an American citizen because, as we talk about in the book, all due process of law was denied. But my father, was a man of principle, and it wasn't complicated to him. He lived by the moral code of, he treated everyone like he wanted to be treated, and made the decisions very simply. It wasn't complicated. Why should he be put in prison camp when he had done nothing wrong? And he didn't have any privileges as an American citizen to due process of law. And so that's why he was arrested. And when Mr. Bessick from the ACLU of Northern California, who was then the executive director at the time, visited my father in jail and said to my father, if need be, we'll take this all the way to the Supreme Court. My father really believed in this country and our democracy, and really our checks and balances that we see are being pulled away and really challenged these days. And so his fight for justice was long. And what I want people to know, and teachers and students to realize, that from the time that he was arrested and put into Tan Foran Detention Assembly Center in the Bay Area, which was first the horse stalls where people had to live, he was vilified and ostracized from his own Japanese American community. And it took him 40 years to see justice, but he never gave up hope. He never gave up hope that someday he would be able to reopen up his Supreme Court case, but he didn't know how to do that. And his story resonates on so many different levels. So who knew that over 75 years later, that his Supreme Court case of Korematsu versus United States would be really more relevant now than it was in 1942 and 44, when the decision came down first from the Supreme Court. And here, as Rachel emphasized, now we are all over again experiencing the racism and the bullying and the xenophobia because of a particular nationality, and not even American in this case, but affects all Americans. And that's something that we want students to realize, that if they learn about other people's differences, then they won't be so afraid of them, and they can uphold our Constitution and our democracy. Do you want me to talk about this?
If you want to talk briefly about this slide, and then we can hand it over to Laura and Stan.
Okay, so I just want to point out that this is my father, who is standing in front of my grandparents in the flower nursery in East Oakland that my grandfather built. And his three brothers are on the opposite side. So he's about 21 years old here. And when he resisted the military orders, he was 23 years old. So that wasn't, that many years later. But also I want to point out, because this is certainly part of history, that my grandfather was able to buy land in East Oakland, California, before the Alien Land Law took into effect on August 10th, 1913. After that time, if you were in America, if you were an immigrant, you could not buy land, and those laws didn't change until much later.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. So Laura's going to take over the screen share and talk about how the book Fred Korematsu Speaks Up came to be and how they've used it with students.
So while Laura is doing that, let me first share greetings to everybody from downtown Los Angeles. And thank you, Rachel and the UC Berkeley History and Social Science Project for organizing this webinar, and thank you all who are participating in this professional development opportunity. We're really delighted to be able to join you. And Laura and I are going to cover several topics during our time with you. We're first going to explain our personal connections to Fred Korematsu's story. And we'll also explain the genesis for the book, Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, as well as the Fighting for Justice series of books that Fred Korematsu Speaks Up launched. And we will explain a little bit about how the book is organized and include a discussion of primary source materials that are included in the book. We'll describe some student reaction to the book. We've spoken since January of 2017 to more than 8,000 students across the country. And as you see on the image on your screen right now, on the right, there's the question, how can you be like Fred and speak up for what you think is right? And we put up that question because it really was a motivating principle for Laura and me as we wrote Fred Korematsu Up, and also now as we're sharing his story throughout the country and actually throughout the world as well. So that's a brief overview of what we're going to cover. So this photo is of my mother, and it's her high school, one of her high school graduation photos from Manzanar High School. So she was incarcerated during World War II and graduated from the high school that was in the camp at Manzanar, which was in the Owens Valley in the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada. So I knew, unlike many people in my generation, I knew that my parents, my grandparents, my uncles and aunts were incarcerated during World War II. But like many in my generation, I didn't know that much about it because my parents' generation, the Nisei and their immigrant parents, the Issei immigrant generation, really were traumatized by that experience and didn't want to talk a lot about it. So it's not surprising that I didn't know a lot about it when I was growing up. But I did know at an early age that that experience had happened, and that I too, as a Japanese American, if I were alive in 1942, would have been incarcerated as well. And I also knew at an early age that people could be targeted, not because of anything that they had done, but just because of what they look like and who they were. So that early knowledge inspired me later when I was in college to become involved in the movement that developed in the 1970s and 1980s among Japanese Americans and others to petition the United States government for a formal apology to all Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated during World War II, as well as monetary payments to those who were still living at that time. So that was one way that I started to answer that question, although I didn't know the question existed at the time, of how I could stand up for what I believed in and be like Fred. So when I was a student at UCLA in the 1980s, I became involved with the organization whose banner is here in this photo on the left, the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations. And that years-long effort resulted in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signing the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which resulted in a formal governmental apology and monetary payments to Japanese Americans who were still living. That involvement with the redress movement really spurred me to become involved in other Asian American issues. I ended up writing for the Asian American student paper at UCLA. There's a picture of me on the upper right in Washington, D.C. in 1983 when I was a college student at the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington. And then eventually I moved to the Bay Area and got involved with LGBTQ activism, HIV/AIDS volunteer work. And I eventually worked for the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California for about 14 years in the fundraising department. And I was very proud to learn when I first started working at the ACLU that it was the affiliate that represented Fred Korematsu. And when I was a student at UCLA, I heard Fred Korematsu speak. This was soon after his criminal conviction was overturned. And I was really impressed with him as a person and his story. And what I really identified with him about, if that's the right grammar. Anyways, I identified with him because he seemed like somebody who could be in my family. And he wasn't a big man or a tall man or didn't have a loud personality or a loud voice, but he really taught me that I could stand up for what I believe in and speak out against what I think is wrong. So ever since then, more than 30 years ago, Fred Korematsu has been one of my heroes. So that was a personal motivation for me to be involved in this project.
And can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. This is Laura Atkins, and I came to this book from a different background, which is that I was raised in a family of activists. So you can see over here is my dad at Kezar Stadium in San Francisco at the anti-Vietnam War protest in the late 60s. Thousands of people there. My mom, who's over here, and her now wife, Jan, met through a singing group. So they would sing at protests. This was one, I think, for women's rights. So I grew up in Berkeley, California, and very much, kind of stewed in a stew of activism. This is a picture of me in the 7th grade at Martin Luther King Junior High School, where my child is now in middle school. And one of the issues we were really worried about at the time was the development of nuclear weapons, which I'm sure many of you will remember. And in the 7th grade, we decided to create a group, which is over here, and talk about what we could do to make a difference. And then later in high school, the picture on the right shows a group of us going to Lawrence Livermore Labs, which was producing nuclear weapons at the time. And we were arrested. And when Stan and I do presentations, I explain that it got written up in the newspaper and show a picture of that, which showed me at a young age that when you speak up, sometimes grown-ups pay attention and you can make a difference. And so what that for me has turned into over my life is really around children's books and being an advocate and activist. So on the left here, I was an editor at Children's Book Press, which was a nonprofit publisher of children's multicultural and bilingual picture books, an editor at Lee and Low Books, which some of you may know as an editor, publisher of multicultural picture books, and also being very involved in advocacy and equity in the children's book world. So part of the Social Justice Children's Book Fair, which really highlights independently published children's book creators, because the mainstream children's book world tends to be fairly capitalist and white dominant. And then more recently have founded Manzanita Books with a goal of publishing underrepresented stories about California history. So for me, the idea of sharing stories with kids, stories, whether they're fictional or nonfiction, it's a crucial way for us to empower a next generation to really understand what happened in the past so that they are empowered to make different decisions moving forward. So for me, coming to this help co-write with Stan was an opportunity to highlight the story of a key civil rights activist in our local region and also in our nation. So yeah, Stan.
So Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, the book that Laura and I co-wrote, came about because of the man who's pictured in the middle of this slide. His name is Malcolm Margolin, and he's the founding publisher of Heyday Books, which published Fred Korematsu Speaks Up. And Heyday also published the book on the left, Wherever There's a Fight, which is a history about civil rights and civil liberties in California, that I wrote with my dear friend Elaine Ellenson, who's pictured on the right. And we met each other, Elaine and I, at the ACLU of Northern California when we were both working there. And soon after Wherever There's a Fight was published in 2009, Malcolm wrote to me and said, hey, I have an idea. Why don't we do a children's version of Wherever There's a Fight? And I thought, wow, what a great idea. And I raised my hand and I said I wanted to work on that, even though I had no experience writing for kids before. And it was with a mixture of both hubris and naivete that I thought, hey, how hard could it be to write for 10-year-olds? Well, once I launched into this project, I discovered, at least for me, how hard it was to write for 10-year-olds. So that's how Laura got involved in this project. But before I hand the baton back to her, let me explain that Fred Korematsu's story is the first in a series of books that is published by Heyday. And we decided to start with Fred's story in part because it was central to Wherever There's a Fight. It begins that book It ends that book, Fred's story, and there's a significant portion of a chapter on the Japanese American incarceration about Fred Korematsu. So it seemed pretty natural to me to begin the series with his story, as well as what I said earlier about Fred being one of my personal heroes. And I want to do a slight detour and point out to those of you who are middle school teachers or high school teachers or know middle school or high school teachers that there's a website for the Wherever There's a Fight book. And if you look on the Resources for Educators link in the menu bar, thank you, Laura. If you click on that, there are 2 lesson plans for middle school teachers and 4 lesson plans for high school teachers. So now I'll pass the baton to Laura.
So the way I got involved is I was speaking on a panel in 2015 in San Francisco, run by the Association of Children's Librarians of Northern California. You can see with the very well-known Jacqueline Woodson, but a variety of authors. And I was speaking really to talk more about the publishing industry and diversity and equity in the publishing industry. And the editor, Molly Woodward from Heyday, was there and came up and spoke to me afterwards and asked first if I might be interested in kind of doing developmental editing or co-writing on the book, and I was delighted to get involved, which led really to Stan and I working on this together. And as you can see here, it's there's 2 books in the series at this point, published by Heyday Books in Berkeley, Fred Korematsu Speaks Up and Biddy Mason Speaks Up. As Stan was just mentioning about the amount of work involved and the challenges in particular of writing for a young audience, I think by the end of this, Stan was ready to pass the baton. And at that point, Heyday asked if I would like to keep writing the series, and I proposed the idea of co-writing with different people whose lived experience connected to the story that was being told. And through a small effort, reached out and Arisa White is a poet who teaches in Maine at Colby College, co-wrote the Biddy Mason Speaks Up book. And Yutaka Hulett was the illustrator for Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, and Laura Freeman was the illustrator for Biddy Mason Speaks Up. And some of you may recognize Laura Freeman for many books, but she got the Coretta Scott King Honor Award last year for her Hidden Figures picture book. And with the series, we had kind of 5 goals, the E's, which were handy. So the idea that we want to engender empathy so that the readers really put themselves in the shoes of the person whose story that's being told, and also the larger community who are part of that, because these are stories of activism, so it's not just one person. Educate, so that we're helping readers understand their rights as citizens, the history of discrimination, and how citizens and others have fought for justice, and also just understanding a historical period better as well. Engagement, that they're being engaged to look at their own contexts, and we'll tell you a little bit more about how we do that through the book's format. Empowerment, inspiring readers to feel empowered to make a change in their own world, and also entertainment. We're hoping that these books, and luckily the feedback has been that people, young people and teachers, are engaged and entertained by this story. And so we wrote the book in a few different ways, and we're just going to introduce you to some of the kind of format and presentation. So I'm going to read to you the first poem. The books are told through a mixture of poetry and other media. So the book starts with this: getting a haircut. Fred's hair needs cutting. His friends have the snazziest styles, short and sharp, slicked down and combed back, all the rage. Up until now, Fred's mother has cut his hair. Straight, simple. Fred wants to get his hair cut by a real barber. He walks into his local barber shop. The waxy smell of pomade oil mingles with the sound of snipping scissors. "Hey boy, what do you want?" the barber says. "I just want to get a haircut," Fred tells him. "We don't cut hair of your kind." Why? Because Fred's parents are from Japan. The barber shop won't serve people who look like Fred. Fred knows this isn't fair. He has as much right to that haircut as any of his friends. Fred walks out past other barber shops that will not cut his hair and restaurants that will not serve him food. He goes to Oakland's Chinatown, where people who look like Fred are welcome. He gets his hair cut in the latest style, just like his friends.
So in addition to telling Fred's life story in our book, we also provide background information that explains to readers what was happening in the world, in the US, and California during Fred's life, and really tries to broaden out Fred's story and the story of Japanese Americans to make connections to other communities. And so as you see on the right side of this slide, the beginning of the background section that accompanies the poem that Laura just read, and it focuses that background section on the concept of discrimination against various groups throughout US history. And so let me just point out some features that would hopefully be especially helpful for you as educators. So you'll notice certain words are highlighted in orange or written in orange. So we provide definitions on the sides of pages for words that are written in orange. And in this case, discrimination is one of the major words that we define. We also have questions throughout these background sections for readers to ponder, and they're questions that you can pose to your students and get responses from and get discussion going. So in this case, the question is, have you ever been treated badly because of how you look or speak? If we go to the next page, you can see some primary source materials, illustrations, and photos. And there's also a timeline of significant events in Fred's life, but also world and national events. And with this section focused on discrimination, we didn't want it just to imply that discrimination is one person treating another person badly, although that's one example of discrimination, but that there are systemic and institutional examples of discrimination as well. So for example, in the timeline, we mentioned the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first time that a specific ethnic racial group was targeted for exclusion from the US. If you look at these different illustrations and photos, you can see other examples of discrimination. So if any of you who are on this webinar are of Irish ancestry, about 150, 70 years ago, you would have been depicted like the illustration in the upper left, like a Frankenstein's monster, because Americans thought Irish immigrants were dangerous and lazy and didn't want them coming to the US. If you look at the lower left, there's an illustration of a white miner attacking a Chinese immigrant, because around the same time that Irish were immigrating, Chinese were targeted as well. So these are just some examples of how we try to broaden the scope of our book. Here are some other examples of secondary sources. So if you look on the right, these are propaganda illustrations that the US government published during World War II. We have photos, or excuse me, an illustration on the lower left done by a Japanese American artist showing a Japanese American family who only had a few days to dispose of their belongings before being incarcerated, and they had to sell their refrigerator. If you look at the photo to the left of that painting, there's a little girl in Oakland who had to leave her home. And we just wanted to point out that teachers have used our book for lesson plans in addition to Jennifer. And one of the schools that we spoke at in Walnut Creek, California, asked eighth graders, all eighth graders, to read our book. And one of the assignments that a teacher gave to her students was to actually take a book out or take a bag out and pack their bags and to write about the experience of taking that packed bag to their car as if they were going to leave their home and not know if they could return again. So if we move to the next one, another primary source on the right is a letter that Fred Korematsu wrote to Ernest Bessig, the executive director of the ACLU in Northern California, that represented him all the way up to the Supreme Court. Go to the next slide. Oops, the other way. There's a memo that we have, or part of a memo, a government memo written by a Department of Justice attorney to a colleague, basically saying that the US government was lying, presenting false evidence to the US Supreme Court in Fred Korematsu's case. And as you can see, we have the citations for all of these sources here in these slides, but also in the back of the book. And then finally, I just want to point out this bibliography of sources that we use to write the book. In addition to the online resources, I also want to point out that there are other online resources that you can find. If you look at the Online Archive of California, which is oac.cdlib.org, and type in Japanese Americans in the search engine, you'll come up with a number of different online resources that museums and libraries throughout California have available to you.
And just to wrap up the ways that we have engaged with students around speaking up, which is clearly an important part of this book, we have a spread that we include at the end of the book with tips, coming back to this question, how can you be like Fred and speak up for what you think is right, with suggestions. We ask this question when we do presentations. We show in our presentations these examples that Stan and his husband David at the Women's March in Los Angeles on the upper left. That's me and my kid Cassie at a rally against hate in Berkeley. But we also highlight, young people being involved in movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement, defending the rights of Dreamers in Dhaka, the Standing Rock protests, and also fighting for the environment, young people fighting on around gun control. But we make the point of saying there are many ways that you can speak up. And when we've asked students, what do you do? We've heard some really inspiring stories. So for instance, this was at Fred Korematsu Elementary School in Davis, the first school named for Fred Korematsu. And then these three, Jana, Mona, and Batul, shared with us that the horrible story was that their mosque had been vandalized, but that they, with their teachers in school, had raised money to pay for the repairs. And they were clearly really proud to tell that story and really supported by their community. Lisa Bishop is a librarian in San Francisco, and she has typewriters set up at a middle school library, and she invites students to type letters. And she told us she had a student who typed a letter to then nominee Trump, and she had said, we're gonna make a copy of this and put the date on it because this is history, what you're doing, and we're gonna save it. These third graders at an elementary school in Oakland shared with us that they had, the day after the election, felt very disheartened, and the teacher and they collectively had created this art as showing ways that they would speak up. So it has been a really powerful and moving experience for me and Stan to share this book and hear all of the amazing thing. And this is just a small example of what we've heard. So I want to wrap, I think, us up so that there's time for you all to ask some questions.
Thank you, Karen, Stan, and Laura. And we've gotten some great questions in the chat. I wonder if you could speak briefly to how you selected the sources and how you thought about formatting the historical text in relationship to the narrative text, and why that might be useful for young readers.
Laura, do you want to talk about the poems versus the historical text?
Sure. Yeah, that was, when we came to that decision, we got feedback. We spoke to a lot of teachers and librarians in particular, and some of the feedback we got was that nonfiction text can be very daunting for a lot of readers, even at 4th grade, which was sort of what we were aiming for. I think we've mostly met 4th through 8th grade is who we presented to. And so we were asked to have ideally the writing be even below grade level. And we found that poetic approach is really accessible to all kinds of readers, including, we spoke at Oceanside, where there were adult learners, English language learners, people with developmental disabilities. And part of the feedback we got is that all of these different ways for people to access was a really powerful tool. We had people who told us, multiple people who were from had spoken different languages, that this was the first book they had ever read in full. And we also wanted to really make sure that we give tools to teachers so that if you want to go further, you can find out the sources for the photos and the sources for the quotes and dig deeper with your students.
And regarding those sources, so fortunately, since I had worked on Wherever There's a Fight and had been involved in the redress movement as an activist, I knew about a number of the photos that were available, illustrations, paintings, those primary source materials like the letters and the government memos. And so it was pretty easy for me to identify, I think, the relevant information visual information that we could include in the book. But as we said earlier, we also wanted to broaden out. So it wasn't just about Japanese Americans and just about Fred, but to make the connections between those communities. And again, having co-written Wherever There's a Fight, it was helpful for me to have that information about other communities and their struggles, to be able to find those sources.
This question came up in the text in the chat box, and there was a partial response, but just wonder if any of you, Karen, Stan, or Laura, have insights into. But so Chris asked, what did you learn from going, no, that, sorry. What were teachers provided to the camps, or did those incarcerated teach themselves? And I believe in the chat, it was shared that there were teachers, but I just wondered if you all had broader insights into that, and it also made me think about our contemporary context, not to simplify parallels, but of thinking about teaching in difficult situations.
Karen, did you want to answer that? I can, but if you have anything you want to say.
You hear me? Can you
I
hear
just unmuted you.
Oh, yeah, I mean, okay. Probably a good thing. Yes, you know, what I especially want teachers to know is that when the Japanese Americans were sent to the 10 permanent, as we say, 10 incarceration camps, they were given very little, and any of the community they had to create themselves. So it was the parents who were demanding that the education had to continue for their children. And so it wasn't, you know, schools weren't planned for, hospitals weren't planned for. All the incarcerees had to, even my father, when he got to Topaz, Utah, had to dig ditches to help create the hospital there. So everything that they did, their lives and community, they created on their own. Now, first of all, what they did was try to determine where the teachers were in these incarceration camps. Usually there could be anywhere from, let's say, 8,000 to 10,000 people in one of the incarceration camps. So they kind of started there. But of course, then, you know, where are you going to teach these students? And so they would be in the different barracks and have to find different ways to hold classes. Now, if they, in some cases, if they learn, let's say they didn't have certain high school students or high school teachers available, then they would have the War Relocation Authority, who was really the government entity that was supervising all these incarceration camps. You know, the parents had to demand them to bring in teachers from the outside, and so even teachers that were in the camps, you know, would write to their colleagues and ask them to send in materials, because there were no books, there wasn't any paper, there wasn't anything of supportive materials for teachers to carry on with education or lesson plans or anything like that. So it was a very much of a trickle-in effect, and it you know, eventually you know, they were more organized, but certainly it was a challenge. And the one thing that really was heartbreaking, you know, you can bring this to relevancy now, especially for, I mean, I think back in, I remember, I think I saw Charles Wilson on this, and he was a principal at the Fred Korematsu Discovery Elementary School in Oakland, and that was K through 5th grade, and I was even the commencement speaker one year for the 5th graders. But you can imagine from, you know, elementary, middle school, high school, even college, law schools, the commencement ceremonies have been canceled. And so there are many students, even in high school, who had to graduate and have some type of commencement ceremony behind barbed wire. You know, that's outrageous. And so you can bring really the relevancy of the experience of the Japanese American incarceration to what's happening now, and the way that people have had to sacrifice and compromise and endure these, you know, I mean, as kids say, oh, this isn't fair. Well, you know, that welcome to the real world. And these are kind of the lessons that we want students to learn today.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen, for that. And I'm just so many connections I'm thinking about in terms of creating relevance for students. We have some more questions, but I'm going to save them so that we can move forward with Jennifer sharing about her lesson. And for those of you who aren't following the active chat, We will have a link at the end of the webinar. We will share the presentation with you all, but that links to a full version of the book that you can borrow from a virtual library. I know also some of you have already said you want to buy the book, and also the lesson materials will be available to you. So Jennifer.
I should know about this unmute button by now. So I was really inspired to use this book. I pretty much use it as the central point of my unit on the Japanese incarceration. And the first unit we're going to look, or the first lesson we're going to look at is the getting a haircut. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But our big unit question is, how are Japanese Americans living in the United States otherized during World War II? And we wanted to look at how government actions, how racism, how different events can force other people to be otherized, can be pushed out of, we look at them very differently. So in this first one, we're looking at what events led to the forced removal of Japanese Americans. And what I wanted to do, next slide. Okay, so there are 3 parts to the unit. The first part deals with the pre-incarceration period. And this is where students explore cultural and economic and legal discrimination. And I know Karen mentioned earlier about the Alien Act. And the kids at this point have looked at the Alien Act, and they've looked at different legislation that limits immigration. And then the second part of the unit looks at the forced removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans. And then the final part looks at the post-incarceration period, where we look at the reopening of Korematsu and some of what Stan was talking about with the movement for redress and reparations. And we're really also linking that idea of redress and reparations to an African-American movement for redress and reparations as well. So the unit, like I said, is divided into these 4 parts, and each one pretty much looks like this. It's a module, and you can teach all 3 of them or all 4 of them if you want, or you can teach one. It's okay. They have the same things. They have visuals. Most all of them have videos. There are also photographs that go with them. And for us, a real source of information was Densho. And particularly, I think what it did for the kids is being able to see the interviews with different Japanese Americans who had been incarcerated through the Densho videos. It brought it alive to the kids. And I think both reading the book about Fred Korematsu and looking at the videos made them seem like real people. And I think in past times when I had taught the units, I think there was, it was a long time ago for a lot of kids. So I think they had a hard time visualizing it. So in this first part, what we look at are the events that led to the forced removal. And the 3 selections that we read are getting a haircut, pruning the roses, which Karen also talked about her grandparents owning the nursery, and then exploding in 1941 and what happens when his family hears the news about Pearl Harbor. Okay, so this one here the first module takes about 1 to 4 days. The first day, the kids just look, what I do is I put all the pictures that we're using in the unit up on the wall, up on the outside. I try to use the hallway bulletin boards, and the kids just kind of go through and look at them, begin to write some questions, kind of think about the experience as a whole. And then I show these first 2 movies, this movie called The Community Grows Despite Racism. And this, in this movie, I show the movie twice. The kids just watch it the first time, and then they take notes the second time. The thing I really like about this movie is that it talks about 2 different people's experience with racism. So the first person, Frank Miyamoto, there's 2 Franks, and the kids get a little confused on it. His father loses his job. He's a logger in Seattle. But the second one is about a man, Frank Yamasaki, who wants to go swimming with his friends in the pool. And it's the kind of experience the kids can all relate to. They've all, they go swimming with their friends, they hang out with their friends. And a lot of them have been turned away at the pool as well. We kind of talk about the kind of historical racism that goes around the public pool. But this video sticks with the kids almost through the whole unit. They will keep coming back to the two Franks. Then we read Getting a Haircut. And we talk a little bit about what the barbershop means to kids. And this whole idea of, you know, when it talks about, I'm going to turn to the next slide here. I'm not doing, okay, there we go. So we talk about this idea up until now, Fred's mom cut his hair, and the kids can all relate to that because they're like, oh my God, they remember when their mom cut their hair. But they also remember this kind of community belonging that they have in the barbershop. And a lot of my students have gone to the same barbershop since they were little kids, and the barber knows them. But this idea that the barber would turn somebody away really gets to the kids. And I think using this Getting a Haircut as the introduction, I think places Fred Korematsu as a person who wants things that other kids want too, like Karen kind of talked a little bit about that, but also the feeling of being young and being turned away because of who you are. A lot of my students can relate to that. So I spend a fair amount of time on this. When I first started looking at the book, I kind of read through it quickly, and I realized this is what made Fred Korematsu real to elementary school students. So I think once they're really hooked on this part, they are really looking at this idea of incarceration as happening to real people. And I think for elementary kids, that's often a little difficult to do. I want to talk, I guess there are a lot of people here who are teaching different things. I only teach social studies and English language arts. But I think like somebody spoke, and mentioned Laura earlier, the reading of this is really accessible to kids. And I think for, you know, I have, you know, like we all have a number of different kinds of readers and experiences with reading in our classroom. I feel like this narrative style, the kids who want to go deeper can, the resources are there for them to go deeper. For the other kids that are going to read, you know, who are struggling with reading, this, again, I think by having the quotes and things like that, there are different kind of elements to it that make it accessible for the kids. The layout of it also makes it very accessible. So yeah, I would definitely, so I want to go through a couple of the activities that we do with this. So the first one is, what does it say? What does it mean? And in this one, the kids take sections from the from what they read. And in this column here, I don't have it, okay. The first column, what do the words say? I want the kids to actually copy down the exact words. One of the things we're working on in 4th grade and definitely 5th grade is quoting from the text. So when the kids go to write, they have the opportunity to either use the quote and cite it, or to paraphrase and cite it as well. So I want to go back one other time to the back slide there, the previous slide. So here, some of the things that the kids picked out, like they did this thing here of, he goes to Oakland's Chinatown where people who look like Fred are welcome. So they might write that in the first column, and they might talk about, again, in the second column, what does it mean that it's a community that protects you? And that idea of a community protecting you is important. So they have, this is just a snippet. There's a whole, they can write as many as they want or as few as they want. And they do this together so they can talk about the quotes. The next piece is looking at visual paintings, or sorry, photographs. And this one here, it's from a series that the New York Times did on photos that were banned, that Dorothea Lange took, they were banned by Roosevelt. So it's kind of an interesting article. But what I want the kids to see with this is, how does this relate to the passage that we just read? And here you have in the picture with the flag, these are kids in school. And, you know, they want to have that school experience, you know, and again, looking at what leads to it, that number of these kids here will be incarcerated later on. And then this, we do a little bit about Japanese farmers and the whole idea of not being able to own your land if you didn't buy it before the 1913 Alien Act, Land Act. Okay, we can go on. So again, each photo's numbered, and again, they're going back to, it's a little bit different. They're not really necessarily analyzing the photograph, but they're looking at how does it relate to the section of the book. So it's a little bit different task. So when I want to think about looking back at the kids, the photograph of the flag, they wanted to be kids. Fred wanted to look like other kids. You know, he wanted to have a haircut like other kids. So again, talking about that relatability to him. Okay. Okay, this one here on the video, this is right in the column over here. There's a whole series, and we actually use all of these videos over here. The community grows, looking like the enemy. They're really well done, and I would really encourage you to use the videos alongside the text. Anyway, so what the kids do is they watch this twice. Second time they take notes, and if you want to flick to the following page. So again, in the video, same question, how do these events relate to what they just read in the book? So again, that book is really the central part of the unit. You can turn to the next. Okay, so the last thing they do after they've read all 3 of the articles in the module, I have them do what we call a mind map, and they just write down the 10 most important things to them. And these lines here that you can see, they're linking this to one central idea. And this was this kid's one central idea here, which unfortunately, I'm sorry, is a really terrible photograph and you can't really see what it is. I have the kids organized in this way because emotionally there's a lot that they see, and I didn't want them to just start writing down these facts without thinking, how do they construct meaning out of this event? How do they, you know, so I give them, so this is how they organize it here with the 10 different things. Okay, I think that's it. Somebody asked in the questions what
for you, Jennifer. I wonder if you could talk a bit about, I mean, you teach 4th and 5th grade. There was a question in the chat about, do you think 2nd and 3rd graders could be introduced to this topic? And so just thinking about the age appropriateness or how you introduce this topic and concept to younger kids.
You know, I think you can. And I think somebody mentioned the thing that they lived in Merced. I think I was looking at those questions too. And I think, you know, I grew up in Orange County, and I remember I was in high school, and we could go in the summer and go pick these strawberries from Japanese farmers, right? And I remember asking my mom, why were there all these Japanese farmers in our neighborhood? And my mom looked at me like I was the biggest idiot. Like I had no idea that our house was built on land that was stolen from these strawberry farmers. And we never learned that in school, you know? And I tell the kids that. So I think that when you live in a proximity to things, I think that kids get this idea that there are some gross inequities with land and what land's been stolen. And I think, again, I think, you know your students best, but I absolutely think you could use this book with the kids. You might do it as a read aloud. You might do it more with photographs and not the videos. I mean, my grandkids are that age, and I'm not sure they'd sit through a video, but they would definitely sit there. And in fact, my grandson has read the book. So yeah, I would use it. I would just think about, again, attention span, how long they want to spend to it. And do you want to do a read aloud? And I know Phoebe's class is 3rd grade, so they did it in that. So yeah, I would definitely do it.
Well, I'm just thinking one of the nice things about the layout that makes it as accessible to students and therefore potentially teachers is just targeting discrete aspects of it versus sort of the whole of the book.
Yeah.
So Jennifer, one question I have is, you taught this in a traditional classroom setting. What do you think about, like, if somebody were wanting to try a piece of this with their students in a virtual context, how would you suggest or approach it? Or would you say just wait until the fall?
No, I would actually do it. I think, I think as educators, a lot of us have really struggled with how to bring in the anti-Asian violence that's, happening now. And I think it's absolutely appropriate to bring it in. I think in a lot of ways, it's a digital unit. The videos can be shown digitally. The book is available on Kindle, I guess, through Karen. So I think you could even put the book up on a screen and read it out loud and you know, and talk about it. I mean, maybe you're not doing the writing and maybe you're not doing the reading strategies and all that kind of stuff with it. But I think, you know, how we've been trying to approach some of our Zoom classes is more of a discussion-based thing. And I think this would definitely, I would use the book and I would use the videos from Densha. And just, you know, do use your breakout rooms and have conversation about it. So yeah, I would definitely use it. I'm not sure, like I said, I'm not sure I'd do the reading strategies. I mean, you could.
I also think it just, Karen's bringing up the instances of what it meant to graduate in the incarceration camps, like that there are real points of entry right now in terms of feelings of loss and shift context that could make it pretty powerful for students.
I think that, but I think also, you know, I mean, I don't want to be one of those silver lining people because I don't think there's a lot of silver lining in this thing, but I think also there's a hope, you know, and I think to see someone who's not famous and wealthy and all of that take on the Supreme Court is a pretty awesome thing. And I know when we get to that last part of the unit, the kids are like, I mean, they were so impressed by that, you know. And I think, you know, the whole redress reparations movement, the fact that they were able to get this. And I think for a lot of our students of color, this also gives hope around African-American reparations or, you know, Latinx reparations. I mean, most of these people can, you know, most of these kids can talk about ways that their ancestors have been denied land. And I don't know, I think it's an important thing.
I wonder if any of you, but I'm thinking Stan or Karen in particular, or Laura in terms of word choice in the book, could talk a bit about language use and the use of Japanese American and also the use of incarceration camps rather than internment camps. Would one of you be willing to sort of talk about that a bit?
So in terms of incarceration versus internment, I, for years, would use the term internment until I learned maybe about 10 years ago that that has a specific legal definition that applies only to citizens of other countries who are imprisoned in the US. And since the majority of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated were American citizens at the time, and those who were not American citizens were not allowed to naturalize at that time, incarceration is a more accurate term. Karen, do you want to add anything?
Yes, actually, there is a booklet called Power of Words. It was originally created by the Japanese American Citizens League. So you could go to their website. I believe it's also on our website or in our curriculum toolkit that's also accessible digitally. But you know, and just to kind of go back, I mean, my age range of audience is from 5 years old to judges. And I can tell you that even 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds understand about this really outrageous act of the lack of you know, democracy and that happening at that time. And just to kind of, you know, one of the things I talk about is the euphemism. So I can ask a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, what does evacuation mean to you? Now, it doesn't matter if I'm in California or if I'm in Florida where they have hurricanes or in the Midwest where there's tornadoes, right? They all can tell me that either, you know, they have to, and now of course with guns, there's that too, but you know, either the shelter in place or putting your head underneath a table, or, you know, it's for your own personal safety, right? So the evacuation is to move for your own personal safety. And so that's when I take the opportunity to say, well, for the Japanese Americans, they were forcibly removed from their homes. This was not a matter of evacuation for their own safety. And so I have those conversations, but I make it very simple and not in a threatening, manner. And so to have, to talk about those terms, and like Stan said, internment versus incarceration, because internment, as Stan said, is really what was taught, was really the day after Pearl Harbor, when at least over 2,000 immigrants were rounded up and put in Department of Justice camps or Army camps. Dangerous people like teachers that taught Japanese, or Buddhist priests, or those type of people. That was that phase before Executive Order 9066 was issued. After that time, it was incarceration, mass incarceration. So you can even talk about mass incarceration in 1942 and the mass incarceration that's happening now in our prison system. So there's all this, the relevancy, but also to go back and to emphasize, like if you're teaching ELA, that's a great point for power of words, right? And to have essays and to have those conversations, but also just to go back to in talking about kind of age appropriate, to have students also tell their own stories, because we're a land of immigrants, and all of a sudden immigration became like a dirty word. Well, if students understand where their own history of how they came to this country, their ancestors, unless they're indigenous, and then that's also another American Indians, that's another story, how they've been marginalized. I mean, you can pick and choose what's going to resonate with your students depending upon where you are. And Jennifer's right. The backstory to the Japanese American incarceration is agriculture, because the cry at that time in 1942, because the Japanese immigrants were enticed to come to America, a land of opportunity, and they're going to, they can do well, and we'll give you land and do all these, make all these promises. But then, as we do in this country, then the cry is, well, they're taking away our jobs. That's the relevancy of what we're hearing now. And that's definitely another backstory to the Japanese American incarceration. So my father's story and that of the Japanese American incarceration resonates on so many different levels to all age groups. I mean, and because at the end of the day, what my father's legacy represents is social justice. And social justice should be in all aspects of life and career. And if we teach in that regard to bring in the relevancy of one man who made a difference in the face of adversity, and that's what Fred, as you see now, this poster, that's Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties in the Constitution, which is on January 30th, in perpetuity for the state of California, Hawaii, Commonwealth of Virginia, Florida, New York City, and the legislative bills are now, well, they're in progress. I mean, Arizona, New Jersey, but of course, everyone has been shelter in place there, so that's all been stopped. But you talk about the racism and the xenophobia and what's happening now. You can point to Fred Korematsu and the Japanese American incarceration as lessons that resonate to our issues today, that we are still having to fight for, and to educate people, and to stop this bullying and the language of hate. And so that's why this is so important, and this book is a great jumping off point to teach these lessons. So now you will see the curriculum toolkit that we have. So also another resource I might add is go to the korematsuinstitute.org, and you'll see at a header curriculum or digital curriculum toolkit, pull down, just teachers can just sign up. We'll send you a password, have access to our materials, and we just finally got loaded up there the Fred Korematsu Speaks Up booklet, that thanks to Heyday, we were able to publish about 3 different chapters from the original book with lesson plans. And then you can go through that page by page even with your students, or have students look at it on their own. And now parents can even have access to these materials, because we realize that parents are at home, and then they're assigned all this task of also helping their students and to teach at home. So we're trying to make these materials accessible. And if you have an issue or you have comment, we'd love to hear from you at info@korematsuinstitute.org. Even if you have any questions. And also, teachers out there, I don't know if you know, but there's 4 schools named after Fred Korematsu. As was pointed out, the first one kind of officially was the Fred T. Korematsu Elementary School at Mace Ranch outside of Davis, California, the Fred Korematsu Discovery Academy in East Oakland, the Fred Korematsu campus at San Leandro High School, and the Fred T. Korematsu Middle School in El Cerrito in the Bay Area. And then we have a law school that has a Korematsu Center. We have the Institute, and in Hawaii we have a professorship that's endowed there at the law school. So these are the opportunities and the resources that you can go to. Also, I want to tell you about PBS Learning Media. So you're talking about videos. Go there, type in Japanese American, type in Korematsu. What will come up is video clips with lesson plans that is accessible by all. And you can go there and use these film clips. Also, if you want to kind of have your students get an idea of, what did Fred Korematsu sound like? You can go to the Korematsu Institute website and click on the trailer to my father's documentary of civil wrongs and rights, the Fred Korematsu story. In our toolkit, we have the 24-minute version. We're working on to get we're redoing the whole 60-minute version to get online in high definition through a grant. It's not quite finished. But at least the first person you hear and see is my father. And hopefully the students can kind of get an idea, like, what was this guy like? And that might, be able to help as well.
Thank you, Karen. So Laura moved us to the last slide, which we'll send you the slide deck, and has links to the Korematsu Institute, which has a digital toolkit. And thank you, Karen, for making the excerpt of the book accessible. While we'd love for you all to buy the book, we also don't want you to feel like compelled to in order to teach this lesson. Also, the full lesson that Jennifer created is at the Fred Korematsu Speaks Up website. And then, sorry, the second bullet point, and maybe Laura can speak to this. There was a question about copyright. So the second bullet point, Fred Korematsu Speaks Up, is available via an online library.
Yeah, there's a national library that, for the period of being sheltering in place, has made unlimited loans available of ebooks. So there are some people in the publishing industry who aren't very happy about this. I think Stan and I feel like it's a good time for students and kids and teachers to have access to a book. So at this link, anybody and all of your students can borrow the book simultaneously.
And so then also Laura and I collaborated, if you're a California teacher, on a bibliography of children's books that are standards adjacent. So take into account what the grade level history, social science standards are for elementary school, and suggest trade books that are social justice oriented and empowering. And then, so then finally, we just ask that you complete a closing poll. If you could stay on, Jason's going to put out the poll. And in the chat box, if there are any topics, whether they be content, pedagogy, mental health, that you would like to learn about during this time, do put it in the chat box. We are working with our friends across disciplines to support teachers right now, and we want to be responsive to your needs. So if you could let us know, that would be great.
Rachel, I wanted to add one thing really quickly, because somebody wrote about high school.
Mhm.
And I think the last part of the book that really talks about the documents and reopening the case, I think is actually pretty rich in a constitutional look at Fred Korematsu. So maybe coupled with that and Stan's Where There's a Fight, I think would really lend itself to doing some high school work.
Yeah, and we'll send the Where There's a Fight link. I was looking for it, but wasn't able to pull it up during the presentation. So Laura's going to go to the last slide, but just to let you know, there is a full calendar of learning available to teachers through the UC Berkeley professional development providers. And we're doing our best to create a running log of recordings and resources of previously shared webinars. And so we just hope that today's hour and 15 minutes and the calendar are one way for us to show care to all of you as we take on this moment of sheltering in place and being in relationship with schools and communities. So thank you for spending your late afternoon, evening with us. And thank you to Karen, Laura, Stan, and Jennifer, and Jason behind the scenes for pulling this session together. It is just really, I feel like, a beautiful showing of the relationships that have developed over many years to make this happen. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening, and let us know how we can be of care and support for you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.